Now, my next guest is somebody I've always found fascinating and somebody I've always wanted to talk to. I've only recently met him when I was going around with the Killarney Declaration for signature, and that's Ben Gilroy, who has a most unusual background, which he'll explain to us all in just a minute. And so you're very, very welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Eddie. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
No problem.
What's fascinating about you, Ben, is that you've been down really in the trenches at the really dirty part of the fight, which is between the very, very strange stuff going on between the vulture funds that have bought the mortgages from people that defaulted and ordinary Irish people that lack the capacity to defend themselves. Yeah. And from that then, I'm just summarising as I understand it, from that then, what's grown out of you is a much broader and deeper political activism. Yeah. And so you've established this new political entity. Its new name. Yeah, new name.
It's a rebrand, for Liberty Republic.
Liberty Republic in 2024. So can you tell us a little bit about Liberty Republic, the numbers?
Sure. Liberty Republic started off as direct democracy, which was a principle that I liked. It was in our first two constitutions. And, you know, the Americans in their constitution have the right to carry arms. And of course, they make no bones about what that is for. It wasn't for hunting primarily. It was in case the government overstepped the mark and infringed on their rights. And they make no bones about it. That was their right to carry guns. Ireland was slightly more reserved, you know, from that point of view. And what they did was, instead of the right to carry arms, they said, we'll carry the right of referendum. That if the government ever oversteps the mark, we have the right to call a referendum on a number of signatures. And that right was in the first constitution. It was then in the second constitution, but it was removed in Bunrock na hÉireann. And when it was removed, the government said, we retain the right of referendum, but it wasn't theirs to retain in the first place. And so I always wanted to put that back into the constitution for a number of reasons. Firstly, I hated politics. I hated politicians. Yeah. By their very nature, they lie.
Yeah. Well, that would make it normal, Ben. But
so I didn't like the idea of politicians or politics. But I always felt that we should trust our grandparents and our great-grandparents who fought the oppressive British regime at the time. And then it was them who left direct democracy in our constitution as a right of protection for us, their children, their grandchildren, and I wanted to leave that for our children and our great-grandchildren going forward, because you can see world elitism and corporate powers taken over today. And so how do you fight these big world leaders, these elites? And it was simple. It really came down to the pen is mightier than the sword. And if we were to call a referendum on the bank bailout or the WHO lockdowns or this EU Migration Pact or anything that's going on, today, if we had the right to call a referendum, there'd be no need for sovereign people to be out in bad weather, protesting, having running battles with Gardaí. None of that should be here for us. You know, that wasn't the foresight of our great nation and our ancestors. It was that we simply call a referendum. So I like the idea of that.
So in other words, to counterbalance the massive power at the very top,
that's right,
you need to increase the power at the bottom, which is amongst the people.
And it's not for revolution or violence or anything. It was a very peaceful means, which I loved as well. And it was just that if I felt strongly about immigration in this country, and I thought it was diluting the diaspora or our traditions, our culture, or everything. Because remember, we're not like the UK that could absorb 3 million easily into the UK and probably wouldn't notice it. If we took 3 million into this country, we'd be outnumbered in no time. So what I liked about this idea of direct democracy is that if we felt strongly enough, all you had to do was gather enough signatures to call a referendum. And then when a referendum is called, you get equal airtime. So it's not like RTE running the show. You get equal airtime and equal money to spend on your referendum of the counterbalance argument as well. And then at least if you lose, you can blame yourself. You ran a bad campaign. You didn't put it properly to the people. But at least you can say, you got screwed over by someone who was corrupt. It was your referendum. You ran it with equal money, equal airtime. And at least you have some form of proper democracy, because we don't have a democracy in this country. I mean, if you take immigration alone, I think there's a high 80% in the country is concerned about the huge numbers coming, and the government just keep bullying them into all different areas around the community with Gardaí, acting quite tuggish at times. And that was never envisaged in our constitutions.
So what you've described there, from my understanding of it, is a bit like the Swiss model, yes, where there's regular polls, referendums amongst the people, and it goes just directly in.
That's right, and they don't destroy it, they don't overdo it with referendums. The Swiss have about 2 referendums a year. I remember reading up on one of the last referendums, they wanted to spend a couple of $1 billion on fighter jets. And the people said, not at all, we're not spending that money. We've never been invaded. We've never went to war. We don't need fighter jets. It might encourage people that were looking for war. And they said, no, put it into schools, put it into hospitals. And that's what they did. And that's why Switzerland was run properly, because of a direct democracy system, And
I just want to go back on one thing, just to clear up my thoughts on it. So, as I understand it, the preamble to the Constitution is the Irish people talking to tell this new thing called the state,
yes,
how we want it to be organised. And that the purpose of the office of the president, yes, is to actually protect the Irish people from the state itself using the constitution that they created. Now, you mentioned the 2 constitutions, then you said Bunrock. Can I just go through those with you? So that was the 1922 constitution.
And the 1919.
Yes.
So they both had the provisions of the direct democracy in it. Okay. They had a thing called recall as well.
So was the 37 constitution then that diluted all of that?
There's no mention of direct democracy in the last constitution, Bunrock na Hern. And when questioned on it, the government said, well, we retain the right of referendum. That was wrong. That's like, say, a new constitution coming out in America, and there's no mention of the right to bear arms. And the government said, oh, no, we'll have the right to bear arms. And you think, what happened there? Do
you know what's fascinating about that is that in the 37 constitution, up until in the earlier constitutions, and even before that, the Irish people owned all our natural resources, the air coming across the water and so on. And then in the 37 constitution, the state made itself the guardian of all the natural resources of the country. Right.
Everything in the ground down below. You own the house while it's on the land, but they own everything down below and everything above.
And all the ways across to the middle of the Atlantic, right? But then they say, so we're the trustee of that on behalf of the people. But then under another part of the constitution, they made it non-justicable, so that the people couldn't do anything about it if the guardian didn't do their job properly.
Well, again, I honestly...
And that was De Valera's canniness. And as I recall, because I remember researching that at the time, that the only people that spotted it, the subtlety of it, were the Jesuits.
That's right. Yeah, well, they're acute too, though. But if you think about direct democracy, I remember when I first introduced sort of direct democracy, trying to get it back in, and a lot of radio commentators were saying to me, oh, but Mr. Gilroy, sure, there'd be a referendum every day of the week. And I thought this was the sort of thing they were saying. And I was saying, well, that's 365 referendums. I said, I can think of 10. And the only reason I can think of 10 is because the government have gone so rogue over a number of years that there's 10 major issues need to be sorted. But that could be done in one day in one referendum. It's easy. What do you think about this? Yes or no? Yes or no? It's simple to do. But I said, what really is the point is, I always say to them, to the presenters, what would the referendum be about that you say there's 10? And they sort of get stumped by that, and they think, right, what would there be a referendum about? And then I help them out, and I say, well, the bank bailout. And I say, would there have been a referendum on the bank bailout?
Would there what?
Say, absolutely, right? And I said, no, there wasn't. And I said, because if we had the right of referendum, they would have never bailed out the banks.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they knew the power was with the people. Was there.
The power was with the people.
That's right. So they would never bail out the banks. And that's why I always say that direct democracy is like a policeman sitting in the Dáil on government decisions. The government are looking at that button that the people can push to say stop. And it leads to good governance without a referendum ever being called. That's why I say there wouldn't be a referendum every day. In our first 2 constitutions, it was never triggered, the right to call a referendum, because the government behaved itself.
And you know, when the right was taken away then back in the day, because you've looked at it, did it not become a public issue, or did it
no,
did it just
a lot of people never thought of it because it was a new state and we were coming out of civil wars and nobody wanted problems, and the state was doing well and we were getting electricity and we were getting water, and so the state was moving and it was going in well, but obviously there could have been foresight way back then, but it was an important part from the elitist point of view to remove that first from Ireland. And
when I know it's an area that you have been immersed in, but you were in other areas now. But when you then look at what has happened at the interface between Irish debtors and their creditors, the vulture funds, and it looks as if there's been substantial problems in terms of these third parties coming in claiming that they own the assets when clearly they don't.
That's right.
And yet that hasn't been, the courts themselves seem to be nervous of the whole. I'm only trying to summarise my basic understanding.
No, you're right. Well, look, the problem is I've researched this for 15 years and I've approached certain people who have asked for the evidence and I've shown the evidence, and now they've sort of gone with it. And Edmund Tunahan has done great work in this too. And
he's the former president of the
former Master of the High Court. And he's a great guy, always was. And so he took it on. I think he really took it on first that he was going to prove me wrong, that this couldn't be such wide-scale fraud. So like he would do, he asked me for the evidence of this and the evidence of that. And when I gave him all the evidence, he started to realise, oh my God. So I was going to call you up when you introduced me, but when you said the vulture funds purchased the mortgages, all my friends listening would be saying, Ben, cut him on that. Tell him that didn't happen.
Correct me. Correct me.
So the vulture funds didn't buy any mortgages. And most of them charade themselves now, which is a criminal offence. I mean, they registered themselves as the owner of these mortgages.
Just what you mean they didn't buy any of the mortgages?
No, they have no money. Like I always say, follow the money. If you look at the accounts of a lot of these people.
Okay, just to go back so that people coming to this for the first time. Say I'm AIB. Or Bank of Ireland, and I want to get this stuff off my balance sheet. So what do I now do?
Okay, so normally you would go to private equity firms in the United States, and they set up what's known as SPVs, special purpose vehicles here in Ireland. But the first thing they do is they buy the mortgages as a true sale. It must be a true sale, not a synthetic type securitization. And what that means is that they're buying lock, stock and barrel. The reason the investors do that and to have security for their investment is those assets must be bankruptcy remote from the originator. So let's say AIB or Permanent TSB was to go bankrupt. A bankruptcy liquidator can't come in and seize them assets. So they are the property of the investor. But the investor cannot service them. That's the problem the investor has, or the SPV that he set up. So what they do is, and this is how you know it was a true sale, then they have to do a servicing agreement back with the originating bank to service the mortgages. And in these agreements, it says, we'll keep this private and don't tell Land Registry and don't tell the borrowers, because this is the fraud being perpetrated. And you have the top accountancy firms all involved in this, because the accountancy firms, and I have all documents that I found, they're advising the bondholders that they've bought these mortgages and that they're bankruptcy remote and they're safe, and therefore they're getting a AAA rating, because you wouldn't get a AAA rating if this wasn't a true sale. You're putting $6 billion to buy a pool of mortgages.
That's actually unreal. That's actually a phantom.
That's right.
Phantom asset.
So because you wouldn't put that money on the table with a AAA rating if the originating bank went bankrupt and they would seize all your assets. How would you get a AAA rating on that?
But has it now reached the point that such has been the scale of all the action around here for several years, and such as the reputations and careers and everything invested in it? How are we going to expose it?
Well, we've tried, in fairness to Edmund Tunahan, he's done great work. He was in the Oireachtas committee for a couple of hours. He went to New York and did a press conference. But it's like that it sounds complicated to people, and I tried to simplify it. You know, that your mortgage was sold. None of these people, like the Peppers, the Everydays...
but what are the view of the courts then? Surely this evidence is going to go before...
So for years, the courts were looking at the law. And that's what the courts really have to do. And the law on Section 31 of the Registration of Title Act states that it's conclusive as to the ownership of the land. But somehow they read into that it's also of the mortgage or the charge registered on the land. Now, John Deaney, who was the chief registrar of the property registration for years, he wrote plenty of law books. But in his law book that he wrote on the Registry of Deeds and Title in Ireland, he actually said that the conclusiveness of the register is only as the owner, right? And to any burden on the land, that it's conclusive evidence that there's a burden registered on the land. But it couldn't be conclusive as to the owner of the burden.
Okay.
Because there's a registration gap. I mean, let's say I have a burden and I sold it to you. Well, at that tail, you in some time in the future will register your ownership. But it couldn't be conclusive if I sold it, because on the next day after I sold it, you're not on. I've sold it. So it couldn't be conclusive as to ownership anyway.
So Ben, then on the basis of your experience in all of this, right, I'm just trying to summarize it, right?
Of course.
How do you see how do you see all this unfolding over the next number of years then?
In the next number of years, what's going to happen is people are going to realize that every farm, every property that was repossessed, and every receiver that went in, there's a 98% chance that that was done unlawfully. And the accountancy firms, the big 5 accountancy firms and the top legal firms, whether the legal firms were aware of it, they're aware of it now because we have given them all the evidence. But the accountancy firms can't claim ignorance because they played both sides of the fence. On one side of the fence, they advised the bondholders there were true sales. They explained in their documents, I have them, the difference between a synthetic sale and a true sale. So they were showing the bondholders these are true sales, your assets are safe, you own them outright. And yet, the banks then went to these very same accountancy firms who acted as receivers. And that's why it had to be this in-house dirty secret that they kept among themselves.
Then if it's proven then as fraud, right, then there's no statute of limitations.
That's right. Fraud unravels everything. And I can see over the next number of years, which was your question, is redress.
Okay.
I think it's going to be redress and you either get your properties back or compensation. But it's a huge mess because the courts just looked at the law and a lot of people didn't have the evidence. And now I have all the evidence, and that's really what the problem is going to be.
It could be very interesting because that could potentially give you an awful lot of tailwind behind Liberty Republic. So in the next general election, how many candidates do you think you're going to put up?
Well, we're hoping to run, not flood the country. I think that's wrong because we're small, limited resources. If we could maybe get 5, 6 to 10 candidates, I think that would be the best place to go forward. Okay. Pick sort of high caliber people that know what they're talking about on these issues and several other issues that cause problems, and put all our funds and resources into getting those elected. Okay. Because I think once you have, even if you had 5 people elected, sometimes you can hold the balance of power.
Can you?
And all we'd be looking for is that the right to referendum is put back in the people's favour. Okay. And that's why I say to people, like people used to say to me, well, why should we trust you, Ben? And I said, don't. Yourself, yeah. Absolutely do not. Do you think I couldn't be corrupted by money? I'm sure I could if the right circumstances were in play, if one of my children was really ill or something like that. So don't trust me. Trust your grandparents. They left you direct democracy. And the beauty about direct democracy is that people will never screw themselves. They're easily to be screwed by media and everything else. But when you come to the ballot and you don't want to bail out a bank, or you don't want to sell off our oil and gas reserves, or you don't want the country flooded with illegal migrants, what you do is you just call a referendum and you stop it. And that's the one great power that the elites are totally afraid of.
They're terrified of it.
Yeah, and that's why you don't have to trust me with direct democracy. You don't have to trust any. You could actually let Sinn Féin into power. Dread the thought, but you could let Sinn Féin into power if you had direct democracy, because you control everything they do. And you don't have to referendum every day, because like I said, when I say to people, oh, there'd be a referendum on the bailout.
Because it's self-policing.
Yeah, it's self-policing.
Okay, well, Ben Gilroy, thank you so much.
Thanks, Eddie. Good to talk to you. Good to meet you again. And to your listeners, thank you.